Hey everybody, my name is Ryan Germaine. I am a proud Métis, and I'm excited to be wearing my Métis hoodie that was given to me by Josh today. So very excited about that. That's on my dad's side. I'm also a Doukhobor and a Scouse on my mom's side as well. So very excited to be here with this group. We've got some fellow Indigenous Tech Circle members here with us, and Bryanne, really excited to chat with you. And yeah, I guess my background, I've been in tech. Easiest way to describe me is I heart startups. I've started a number of tech companies over the years, a lot of them in recruitment and in people and culture. And yeah, with that, I'm going to hand it off, and I'm sure you guys are going to do a much better job of introducing yourselves than I would. So please, yeah.
Hi, my name is Carrie Lamb. My spiritual name is Datani Hoshi Sekwi, which means Eagle Whistle Woman. On my mom's side, I'm Saizadena First Nation, which is from really northern Manitoba. We're a fly-in, fly-out community. And on my dad's side, I'm Métis and British. I'm still discovering what that means to me. My Saizadena relatives really speak over my other relatives, so still discovering what that means to me for sure.
Hi, I'm Matthew Unger. I'm based out of Vancouver, but originally from Manitoba. I'm Métis and Mennonite on the other side of my family, so a little bit of a unique blend there. But Métis Cree from the Canadian prairies, all across the prairies, basically. I'm the CEO and founder of a tech company called iComply. We do trust and online transactions and basically digital identity verification, security, fraud detection, etc. Before that, I spent over a decade doing technology management and innovation consulting in a lot of financial services, government, and various applications like that.
Tonsi Josh Nilson, TECHNATION, Willow River Doshti. I'm Josh. I'm from a small little town called Willow River, which is about halfway between Vancouver and Willow River in BC. Métis on my mom's side. We come from Saskatchewan near Duck Lake. And I thought I would bust out a little bit of mischief just because there's so many Métis elders that are on the other floor. So I had to brush it up a bit. I work in games. I started a game studio. I've been in tech for about 20 years. Prior to that, I worked in hospitality because I was discouraged from going into games, and then started a game studio. And we grew that from bootstrap from a couple $1 million in revenue to multiple millions and launched on the TSX. And now I have a small investment company called Masqua Investments, and I'm focusing on investing in Indigenous and underrepresented entrepreneurs in the tech space.
Okay, Sego, Soguego, Bryanne Smart. Hello, everybody. My name is Bryanne Smart. I'm coming to you today from Six Nations of the Grand River, which is a reserve community in Ontario, Southern Ontario. And I am the Associate Director of Indigenous Relations in Co-op and Experiential Education at the University of Waterloo. So it's a very long title, but very happy to be here and share. I have spent a lot of time working in spaces that are inherently colonial, so working with Indigenous folks in healthcare, education, and in law practices, primarily in the court system. So it's all very similar experiences across those spaces for our folks, and so really happy to share with this group and have some conversations in this space.
Amazing. Maybe we'll start at the other side here, but in keeping with TECHNATION's mission here about uniting, how can we work together with government, with industry, with associations, and Indigenous-led organizations to engage and attract Indigenous people into tech?
Are you starting with me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. You know, I was thinking about this question, and even before I guess you posed it, Ryan, what I was hearing in some of the presentations today is that, you know, we're hearing people speak as a student experience or as an employer experience or that educator experience. But really, it's important for us all to work together in those spaces to do that. And, you know, at the University of Waterloo, we operate a lot under what we call the Future Ready Talent Framework. And I've heard that phrase a lot today, Future Ready. How are we doing that? How are we working in all of those spaces to work towards this really complex future that we have for a lot of people? So students, our educators, the position that we have to sort of connect to employers. What are we doing? And I don't see them in the room, but that comment today about that multi-layered cake, right? We're all multi-layered in our own streams, but often those multi-layers converge and they interact with each other and they have connections. And so we really have to think about, how are we coming from all of our separate streams and how are we going to create spaces that work together? Because I've heard in a couple of other spaces too from sessions, employers want more than a 4-month co-op term, or they want to see something different. And that also works for Indigenous folks, right? To think about when it takes a long time to gain comfort, to build relationships, it can take longer than 4 months to do that. So how are we hearing what's happening in industry, making those changes in process as educators are in those spaces so that we can better serve those students who need us to do that for them? And so bridging those connections across those 3 spaces are really important as we move forward.
Yeah, it's a big question, but a couple aspects that I think I'd like to touch on is how do we I think you have to start first at the places where people work and how you make a safe and inclusive place for everyone to work. So with Indigenous folks in your organization, it just requires a lot of work on your part to be able to, it's not, you can go to a talk or do an online course and then you get a checkbox and then you're good to go. I think there's a lot of work and learning that needs to go in if you want to be authentic about it. And I think it takes a lot of time. I think it's a huge challenge. At my last company, Eastside Games, we tried to really push forward in that, and it took a lot of learning for your entire management team to be on board to make sure you're going through this journey to work in this space. But that being said, I think it's worth the work. It's especially in tech and in my sector, which was interactive. What are we calling it now? Interactive entertainment. So that's everything with games and animation. There's representation is about 1.4% are Indigenous or identify as Indigenous. It's not an entirely great number, but that means that there's lots of opportunity if you're going to work in that space to recruit some top talent.
Yeah, I guess thinking of the question, I think one of the things is that the different types of stakeholders it's a very different, especially if you're looking at the population, Indigenous population. Like there's a lot of, for companies specifically, I think there's a lot more opportunity to start with a clean slate. With the government, and even a lot of educational institutions, there's a lot of cultural baggage and organizational baggage of all the history that may have gone on, especially I think in the government aspect. And there's a lot of a lack of trust, I think, of government organizations and funding and different programs that are there. And that can be a hurdle that can create a barrier to access or different things like that. Whereas with companies, sometimes it can be very small shifts and changes that can just kind of open the door or show that you're welcoming. And with our company, diversity, equity, inclusion was something important to include in part of as our core values. And one of the things we started to do as a tech company is say like, well, if we look at the Canadian, statistics, it's about 50% male and female. How do we make sure that we're, kind of within 10% either way, 60-40, 50-50, something like that on male and female? And how do we have, 6-7% of our employee base be Indigenous versus 1.4% and different things like that. And sometimes it's not, it's just as simple as making that a consideration and, or even incorporating it into policies. The other thing is that recognizing that if you are looking at specifically with Indigenous, wanting to attract Indigenous talent, I think there's some barriers around people who grow up, not just Indigenous people, but people who grow up in like a very remote or poor or rough part of Canada. They may not see themselves in a tech role. I know for me, that was definitely, I think we were talking about this yesterday, like, you start out self-taught, a lot of people in the tech space, and like the idea of going to university for comp sci doesn't seem accessible. And I think it requires, having outreach into the communities at a much younger age rather than university age or entering the workforce age, for people to actually even just see themselves in, hey, maybe I could develop games and, work remotely or move to a city and do that if that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you.
As you were speaking, I was reflecting on a program that I took when I was 16 years old at UBC. It was called Sonala Honors Program. And Indigenous students from across Canada were chosen to go to this program. And really, ultimately, the focus was for us to be exposed to something that we may have been afraid of before. And I think that opening up pathways like this type of event, in order for Indigenous talent to come in and just explore what could be, because a lot of us carry such a huge amount of trauma from the impacts of colonization, and we're in a state of healing. And so when we go into these spaces, all of this stuff comes up in our minds. Do I belong here? Should I be here? Maybe I'm not right for this. Like, all of those things are much heightened because we all carry trauma. And I feel like opening up those spaces with the impact of knowing that you're probably going to enter into a space of healing, which a lot of these organizations aren't used to talking about. We look at things from the mind space. We don't look at things from the bodily, spiritual, and emotional selves. We just think about the impact is that we need to, from the mind, we need to attract more Indigenous talent. But what are we giving as far as an experience? Are we trauma informed? Do we know what that looks like when we're trying to support a young person coming into our organizations, when they're not behaving the way that they should? Asking ourselves the really serious question, is that trauma showing up? Knowing that most of us have that, and entering into a space where you can provide Indigenous talent a pathway of healing that's culturally meaningful is so hugely important for Indigenous talent.
Thank you. Thinking about, we in Vancouver, we did an event recently with TECHNATION at Microsoft, and we invited 65 Indigenous students and venture folks and CEOs into the space. And it was really interesting to see how meaningful it was to a lot of the Indigenous folks that were coming into to be in Microsoft, to see themselves in this space, to see other Indigenous founders, venture people, technologists. And I was at another event recently where they were talking about the right to identify. And so this question's a little tricky in that it's talking on both sides of that coin, in that sometimes people just want to show up and do their job, right? They don't want to be the person within the organization that is the Indigenous everything. And what does that actually mean anyways? And so that's one piece of it. But at the same time, we really do need to elevate the Indigenous voices in tech and in business, so that others can see people like them in those roles. And so how can organizations do a better job of navigating that? That was a lot. So maybe if you want to start off, but if you no. Okay, then.
I can start. I can start on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for that very short and to the point question. That was very easy. Amazing moderator. I think it's about what I went to before. I know it's about learning. And I think it's also about, it's a hard journey. So even, I can only speak about my own journey, but really learning on the job and really going from an operator to manager to an executive to going back to sort of that founder role and trying to navigate towards what we do business in. It always seemed a little bit foreign to me. It seems like it's it is like business and school in its very essence is a very British colonial thing. Like we do. Have you ever been to a strata meeting? Like it makes no sense. It's like, forsooth, we're going to all vote and get started on it. I'm like, are we fixing the roof or what? Like what's going on? I'm ready to go. So I think that's something we have to remember when we're mentoring, and not just mentoring youth, but mentoring Indigenous people into roles, is that there's a lot of learning that goes there, because I went to an event recently with Métis Nation BC, and I was able to talk about these things, and the elder just sat there very calm and said, just because this is the way you're built, it's fine. Like, you're not going to do business exactly the way that you see business being unfolded in this new culture of learning from screaming aggressive CEOs on LinkedIn and Twitter and stuff like that. You don't have to do business that way. There's different ways. So it's allowing leadership to be your authentic self, and to have those spaces that are comfortable for people to lead in and to learn from that. So there's no easy question, or there's no easy answer in that, other than I think it's again an amazing opportunity, because it'll just require all of us to work harder in the organizations, that even if you work there, to change them, to make sure you're holding the leaders and the founders of those organizations to work harder to make inclusive places for everyone to lead, and everyone to have an opportunity to grow and make the place better. That's how we're going to make amazing products. So we're going to reach out to customers we never thought that were our customers before.
I think if I kind of add to that, I think what you're saying about the aspect of learning is super important, because it's, in order to do it, in order to make any progress, I think you have to approach it from a lens of curiosity and openness. And there's going to be very diverse perspectives. There's a major tech company, and I know one of the very senior managers there, and they have an initiative in their organization to foster more Indigenous talent. And this person is a friend of mine, but is very against this whole concept, and feels like it's like, this Indigenous person gets a job they shouldn't qualify for just because they're Indigenous. And there's this mindset that exists among some people in society and in organizations, and there's a pushback towards that. And then on the flip side, it's, in my perspective, it's not about that at all. It's the fact that there's really great skills and talents and diverse perspectives that we're losing out on, that could add a lot of value to the organization, or what you were saying around adding value in the way of serving markets you didn't even know existed before. But when you're dealing with, like, if you approach things from the perspective of learning and listening and curiosity, there's going to be people that, there's trauma on all sides. I think in a lot, like, everybody's healing from something. And I think what I've seen personally is that sometimes, somebody will go off and say something about, this racial stereotype, and it's like, that has nothing to reflect. That may be their reflection of what they see about my people, but that is, one, it's not accurate, and two, that speaks so much more about where they're at and the healing that they're going through, and or need to go through. And I think that if we come at it more from a, less right and wrong, and it has to be done this way and has to be done that way, and more from perspective of curiosity and learning, there's a lot more room for people to actually heal, and to actually find a path to healing.
Were you asking about emotional labor? Like was the question about emotional labor when an Indigenous person is hired and having to carry the burden of being the Indigenous expert?
I think that is one aspect of it, and then at the same time is, how do we elevate people recognizing that it's a choice, and how can we go about making that available in a good way?
Yeah. First off, if you're asking an employee, I didn't call in my background. I've been in HR for 21 years, and I love everything HR. I couldn't have chosen something more enlightening for me. I get excited whenever I talk about HR. But for that is, if you're asking an employee to do something that's above and beyond their job description, make sure you're paying them well. There's an emotional burden that happens when we have to be the Indigenous expert. We're navigating conversations where we have a direct tie. They call it vicarious trauma, I think it's called, where we have a connection to the stories that we're having to share. The other thing is that we are not Indigenous experts on all things Indigenous. Across this panel, we all come from different nations. You heard us all identify very differently. I could never speak to my panelists the same way, like in my language for them to understand. And I always share this story about how different we are, where I helped my Blackfoot mother write a book about cooking. And in there, I learned that the Tanaha people who are from Cranbrook area were fish eaters, and the Blackfoot actually aren't. They see fish as very sacred. So there's like this, never understood why they didn't get along. They were tribal enemies, all because of this fish thing. They had an issue, they had a beef. So we have different ways that we are experiencing the world, and it all is tied in with the lands. We are in flow with the lands that we came from. So when we do a territory acknowledgement and we're from that space, we are connected to those lands. We can speak to them in a way that's very beautiful and spiritual. So I think that's kind of sums it up. We're all different. We can't be the expert of all things Indigenous.
Great. I just want to follow up with a couple of points, and I, always sort of come back to the stakeholder perspective from Will. So students, some of our students don't know who they are yet, and that's a reality. Some of our students are entering into post-secondary as the first person in their family, maybe discovering their Indigenous roots, discovering who they are outside of how they've grown up their whole lives. So making space, safe spaces, I know Josh, you talked about that, spaces where people can learn and question and be comfortable discovering who they are is really important. So creating those safe spaces in an education context is vital for those students to learn and begin to identify in a way and feel proud and comfortable of who they are. But then as educators, we need to make those safe spaces. We have to create spaces that those students feel comfortable identifying in. So that's, again, coming into this work and thinking, how are we making space? How are we not making space? How are we excluding? How are we including? How do we think about things differently? How do foundationally, do we start to understand what does colonization mean in this work? What does indigenization mean across this work? What does it mean for us? Because that's our responsibility too. But then as employers, I know we're seeing a lot of employers, corporations, folks trying to reach that call to action 92 for corporate responsibility. That's where we can see elements of tokenism simply because you have to meet numbers. And that's what we think about as difficult when we're talking about measures or measurements or outcomes. Sometimes it's not measurable in numbers, right? Sometimes it's measurable in other ways. And I want to think about that too. So just to always sort of come from those spaces and think about how are we making sure that those spaces are spaces of authenticity? Because if they're not, they're going to be felt. They're going to be felt by the students who are coming into your organization, to the students who you're trying to educate, and to those Indigenous folks who are walking through the door of your organization.
Thank you. Okay, so the next one I know I've asked this question, or we've talked about this a lot with some of the folks here, and so like I look at my my journey, and I was one of the first folks in my family to graduate high school, right? So I didn't really see myself in the space of being in academia. I started my first business at 18 and just made a whole bunch of mistakes, and but you have a few successes and people forget about the mistakes. My journey was very different, and I know that we all come from different places. So maybe talking a little bit about your journey, and then also talking a little bit about how we can create mentorship and making alternative pathways into tech accessible to people who might not have had the normal path into it.
I'll start with my own journey. In the 90s, my generation was often told that in order to be a successful Indigenous woman, that I had to become an administrative assistant, and that was the marker. And I believed that up until I applied for a job that was titled branch administrator. But then what I realized, I was doing full cycle HR, and then I realized I could be much more than what the reality was told to me. So one of the things that happens a lot with society against Indigenous people is that we're told how we are a lot. And then we aren't, and my panelist was talking a lot about discovering our identity. We're not welcomed into spaces where we can discover what that means to us. And so me, just through divine intervention, was thrown into a career that I absolutely adore, even though I was told, like, this is the marker. And I think that that's like, when you are helping people embrace what their dreams are, it's a very vulnerable space. All of that stuff comes up, that negative talk in our heads comes up, and it's heightened and exemplified when we go into a space that we think that we don't belong in. But having that open door, or that welcoming into that space where we can see ourselves in that journey. We're forward thinkers. Most of us are forward thinkers. We can see an actual path that you're going to guide us into a career that's going to feel safe, rewarding, and exciting. That's where we can start to see that transition change, where we see more and more people enter into tech.
Yeah, that's cool. I like what you're saying about the divine path, because it's it's never a straight line between A to Z. I know for myself, both career-wise as well as my Indigenous identity, there was a lot of navigating in that journey, and on the connection with my community and with my family, even on the Indigenous side. I only as an adult was I actually willing to actually explore that. Did I get to a point emotionally where I was willing to kind of open that wound and see what would happen, and it's created really amazing things out of it. It's created the ability to connect with my culture, and even have my son much more grow up in a culture that I wasn't a part of, and I'm experiencing some of the his firsts are also my first at the same time, and we're experiencing a lot of this stuff together. And it's not something, even in the workplace, or there's been many times where it's the right to identify is important, because there are still many situations where I have experienced, if you put out your Indigenous identity, there's immediately going to be a shadow cast on it, and you can see it sometimes in people's perspective. And I've even A/B tested it, and sometimes just out of curiosity to see how different people respond in certain rooms or in certain organizations, and it does make a difference. And so I think everybody's path is is their own, and we can't change the past, right? And what's what happened has happened, and where we are here, we can't change the future. All we can do is be who we are in the present. And it's, for me, it took quite a bit of time to be able to accept and step into the role of even identifying as Indigenous, as Métis, and being able to say, yeah, okay, this is part of who I am, and I don't have to be scared of repercussions, and I actually don't care about the repercussions. If you're not okay with that, then that's more on you than it is on me. But that took a long time to get to that point of, maybe it's just best not to talk about that stuff, and we don't want people to have to ask questions or look at you differently because of it.
I've been thinking about this as I knew it was coming down the line, and how to say this, because I know I mentioned that numbers and markers and those metrics aren't what we need to always look at, but we also can look at them in a really positive way, because if we're not making space to support Indigenous individuals, we have the number of 0, which is not great. But if we have 1, that's an increase of 100%. And what a good metric that is, right? So I think that that's important to think about too, where when you're thinking about creating space, whether it's in your education institution, whether it's in your organization, if you hire and you onboard several because you're trying to have a lot of numbers, right? Say 15 Indigenous people. Okay, great. You made that number, but how many of them are still there, right? Because have you made that foundation for it to be a safe space for them to be in, to thrive in? Probably not. But if your number and you start small and you build those foundations, you're going to have 0. You're going to have a well-positioned staff, a well-positioned organization, a well-positioned educational institution to see those numbers steadily increase at a pace that is going to grow exponentially at some point. And so that's important to think about too. Or often we say, oh, we don't have enough people to think about making a program for it. Well, of course you don't, right? Because you haven't thought to make space for that number to even start. And if you're not making a space for something to start, what are we doing to support, right? So I want to say that, when we think about our students at our institution, we are 0.5% of our overall population in sort of a co-op space. That's not a lot, but it could be less than that, but it sure as heck can be more than that. So we have to be doing those things to make it more than that and to retain people in those spaces.
Yeah, on mentorship, it goes back to it's a different way of thinking, and we can't use the same tracks that in the last talk I was at. It was really good too, because they're talking about you can't do the same things all the time and expect different results. You gotta shake it up. So like, yeah, go young people. You guys are kicking ass. You gotta try. You can't use the same systems and expect a solid Indigenous mentorship. I mean, it's a lot of learning. The word Indigenous is just, we can have a whole talk on that, how big it is, that it encompasses very different peoples within each of those categories between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. It's a really, really big term to use. It's maybe sometimes not the right term to use. And you need to have leaders in your organization or advisors in your organization if you want to go down this path that are examples. And why that's difficult is because we have a word for, first I'll say this, why it's difficult is because it's not really taught to us to do those things, to stand up and say, I'm a good leader, here, let me help you. It's more about keeping your head down, working hard, and these aspects of leadership that we're taught are sometimes foreign and they don't come second nature. So it was actually pretty hard for me to start going through that journey and stepping up and saying, I'm an Indigenous leader in the space, but I was waiting for somebody else. But I was like, if some of us don't step up, then we're never going to get started, and we're never going to be able to start doing that mentorship. It's in tech. Most of the times when I go to a tech event, there's like 2 or 3 other Indigenous leaders. That's it. But I'm sure there are. We just need to make a more comfortable environment for people to go through and to want to come to that space. We're seeing mentorship as one of those areas where some of the work Ryan's doing in Tech Circle, and all of us are in Tech Circle, are trying to figure out how to connect and to do events like this to get the word out and mentor and have new people to step up and to do that. And there's a word in Michif that's Kawichiat Toyak, which means we take care of each other. And that's kind of what you got to think about, is it's more about giving back. And so even though it's a hard path, it's also a path that, we can solve. Métis people have always solved these problems. If it's hard, we're going to do it. But it's sometimes just make it hard and then solve the problem. But it's definitely a way of thinking to do that, and for companies and universities to put in the resources and to just learn about stuff. Like, I'll give you one example that's awesome that I saw a talk that Carrie was on that was amazing. That was just talking about, how do you interview applicants? Are you typing in? How are you naming the interview? Are you making sure it's using friendly terms so that for us, for society seems fine, but can be not a nice word for an Indigenous person? Or are you typing in every single question into the Zoom box so people can see that? Instead of calling it maybe I can't remember what it was, last interview.
Story call?
Yeah, do a story call. If you say, do you want to do a story call? It's like, tell stories all day, bro. I'm there. Like, no problem. But if it's this harsh, like almost like 3 people sitting across from you interviewing. It's not something that just comes natural. That's just one example, and that's one subset of an example, but it's looking at your whole HR process, how to do that. And since they're talking a lot about AI, it's also talking about the biases in AI. If you're using AI to filter your job applicants coming in, that you might want to make sure that you're really watching that process, so there's not that bias that's already kind of built into that, versus you're looking at trying to provide that mentorship.
I think I'm going to ask the big question. Indigenous. So I'm very proud to be Métis. My grandfather was Métis. He passed away when I was 6 weeks old. So I didn't have that connection to family, and it's been a journey for me to learn about that as I've gone. And as I've started to identify as being Indigenous, which I didn't for a long time, it becomes interesting. All of a sudden, you're expected to be the voice of being Indigenous. So maybe how can anyone who wants to be more informed, who wants to learn and to grow, either Indigenous or non-Indigenous, because we're all at different phases of our journey as Indigenous people too, how can we learn more about our roots, but also to learn more about the differences as well too? Because me as a Métis person, I don't know, I grew up and played lacrosse on the North Shore in a reserve. Does that mean I know what it means to be First Nation? Absolutely not. So like, how can we better educate ourselves so that we're making better decisions and it's more informed? And any thoughts about the word Indigenous? Yeah.
I think just going on your question about the word Indigenous, it's an umbrella term. The UN uses it to describe Indigenous people across the world. So it's why I often will identify as Adena, Métis, and British. So I'm calling in my nation and honing in what that means, and people have a better understanding that it's not just a collective experience. And the other thing that happens in HR a lot is that my brothers and sisters from other countries who identify as Indigenous often apply for positions that are sometimes protected for First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. So there's an extra layer of complexity that happens in the HR space when you just umbrella term us Indigenous. And breaking it down allows for people to understand like why those roles are protected or who they're protected for. What was the other part of your question?
Oh, more just how do we educate, and how can you educate yourself to be better informed?
Indigenous identity.
Indigenous identity, but also to learn more about the different, to get to be more informed about, like, there's 250 some odd nations in BC alone, I think, right? So just learning, how do you go through that journey of learning so that when you're working with Indigenous people, Métis, Inuit, First Nation, you're coming from a place of understanding a little bit more.
Go to community. We're beautiful people. A lot of people, I remember when I was talking about reservations, I was telling my boss that that's where I come from. And she said, am I allowed to go there? I said, yeah, why not? Like, how are you going to know who I am if you don't come to my community? We'll welcome you openly with caribou. We'll openly welcome you with love and care, laughter, all those things. We're so much more than what our trauma or those painful stories are that are told about us. There's such a huge, immense of joy that happens within our communities too. Yes, there's pain too, but underneath that pain, there's a lot of richness of understanding who we are.
It's about. Sorry, did you want?
No, you go ahead.
It's about putting in the effort to learn, and I think that's like we put in the effort to learn all of these customs, what it is to be Canadian. We put forth that we know what Canada Day is. We have all these protocols we go through in school, sing the national anthem. We learn all these things. It's the same way with this. It's about learning. we learn a lot from our communities, and they're all different, they're all unique. So make sure that you're doing stuff from the right, you have a open mind, open heart, and you're doing stuff in the right way, and you're going to learn. Make sure you're paying your speakers that are coming in. Make sure you do some research and understand the protocols of what that means when you have an elder come in, and what you have to do for that. And there's learning, there's constant learning, and it's about educating yourself, educating our places where we get educated, and continuing to learn. There's no end in that. There's lots to catch up on, but there's no quick fix. I can't just send you a podcast and then everywhere where you travel, there's going to be a different Indigenous land that you're on. You should learn about that. You should spend some time.
I think just following up on that, it's important to think about learning, or we hear in organizations, oh, we did cultural safety training, check, one and done. It doesn't work like that. Like we've just heard, there's so many different experiences when it comes to what culture means to different folks. Or if you have an organization, or you're part of an organization, or post-secondary education, or you're sending students to different spaces, learn about those spaces, right? Don't only sort of focus in on what do I need to know here or here, where we're from, Ontario, right? How do we learn about the cultures in Ontario? We have staff across the country. So that means that our staff who are out in BC need to learn different. Our staff who are out east need to learn differently. And so making those available for people to learn from all of the spaces, and not just say, well, we did a session on it, we did it. Well, what did you do, right? Did it focus on Indigenous as sort of a pan term? Did you focus in on those individual spaces? So it's being really conscious, I think, when you're entering into some training opportunities, but also knowing that it has to be a really iterative process, because you're going to learn something every single time you take those trainings, whether you think you know it all or not. You're going to sit and you're going to go, oh, I didn't hear that before. You're going to hear from a teacher or an elder who's going to teach you something at that point in your life that sticks with you differently. And so it's an ongoing journey, very much to Josh's point. Like, you can't stop it. You can't say, well, I know it all. As an Indigenous person, I don't even know it all. I don't even come close to knowing it all, even from my own community, let alone communities of friends, family, organizations, spaces. So we all have to kind of keep moving forward, and that's just part of that process.
Yeah, I think one aspect is definitely, like you mentioned, community, but also culture, and so many aspects to the word culture. But just looking at the national holidays, or the days that you get paid time off for, and how many of those might have a different meaning to somebody who's coming from like a Canadian Indigenous background. Canada Day being probably one of the top ones that comes to mind, is a very charged, some people have very different perspectives on what that means. And then at the same time, it's kind of like, if you grew up Christian and you're in the workplace and somebody's celebrating, a Jewish holiday, ask a question about it. Just be curious. Just, learn about it, and, do some research around it. Like, what is, when I'm in different cities, one of the things that I found was really helpful was actually seeing, especially moving to BC, seeing the land acknowledgements, because it was a constant run. First I was like, why do they do this? And it was actually a constant reminder, almost like an invitation that, hey, this is, it's a little bit of like, know your history. You were on the lands of the Coast Salish, the, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh. Like, who were these Musqueam people? Like, what were they about? And you learn a bit more of the culture and the rich history. The other aspect I think companies can do is also within culture is within the arts. There's some really amazing artists in the space, whether it's visual or virtual, painting, sculptures, like all sorts of stuff like this, that you can really bring more awareness to local art and local history. I always find it fascinating when I hear somebody come over from Europe and talk about, like Canada's such a young country and there's no history here. And I'm like, there's tens of thousands of years of history. You're just not looking, right? So there's so much rich history and culture that you can dig into and learn from. And, when I travel different places now, I actually kind of like, hey, what are these Indigenous, like, whose lands are we on? Who are the people that were here? What were they about? Oh, they were horse people. They were people that, didn't eat fish. They did eat fish. Like you can learn a lot of interesting things, and develop what is actually a local, a very localized cultural perspective. We're all in Canada, but Newfies talk differently than people in Manitoba. So like we're all different in Canada as it is, so.
And it's also like a pretty great opportunity for, especially in, I'll just speak from my space, which is interactive media, games, animation, even television. We're just starting to see that sort of come mainstream. And I think that's really exciting, where we're seeing aspects of Indigenous entrepreneurs and Indigenous-led shows start to go out and hit movie theaters, and hopefully soon more video games. I know there's a couple that they're working on, interactive experiences where people can learn through that, but play a game and feel more inclusive in those experiences. So if you haven't checked out what they do every year at Imaginative, check that out. Check out all the games. Don't just check out the movies, and see like those experiences if you really want to learn, because I think that's really the next wave of entrepreneurs, and the next wave of where we're going to work, is we're going to experience all these stories that are familiar to you because you're on the land that they're built. So you're kind of seeing how they unfold, but they seem new to you as well, but also you've been there. I think it's really amazing. I think about that we haven't even started out with having great VR experiences or great video game experiences, and just telling some of those stories from how the Métis used to live. Like people would love that experience, to go through that and to be able to learn that, and how we can fold that back into education, but also into mainstream Canada, North America, Europe, that they can learn about all this stuff that happened, and we're constantly telling it, but now we have a new medium to tell those stories versus just hearing the stories from your family.
All right, I'm being aware of time because we know we've we've got some folks that need to duck out right away to their next session. I did want to add as well too, like, don't be afraid to make mistakes. As anybody on Tech Circle is abundantly aware, I make a lot, and I've got a great group of folks that can help me along that journey. And by the way, Bryanne, I don't know if I've invited you yet, but I would love it if you would join us. I would love it if you would join us at Tech Circle for our virtual events and connecting Indigenous folks around the country. And to give you an example of, we did the event with TECHNATION at Microsoft, and Paige, who in Paige we trust, was coordinating it and got sick, and so none of us knew what the heck we were doing. And then the elder who was supposed to be there was also sick, so we didn't have the elder representation. And so I did the panel, and at the end of it, one of the aunties there took me to school in a very beautiful way. She said, "You know what? We go around circle and we introduce ourselves." And then I promptly sent the mic the wrong direction, and got corrected again by somebody else, I think, in the group.
It could have been the right direction if you were going the Haudenosaunee way.
Yes,
right?
that's right.
So-
And that's another example too.
Yeah, we go the opposite
It could
way.
be clock or counterclockwise too. Yeah. And so
Inclusive.
I was doing the Haudenosaunee way. Yeah. And afterwards I said, you know what, thank you. I explained that our elder hadn't been able to make it. And I said, I am learning and learning from my friends. And so please, I encourage you to, let me know if I'm doing things that yeah.
I just want to add to that, Ryan. I think that's such an important point, because you talk so much about, or you hear so much about being uncomfortable, being living in discomfort. No one likes that, but it's okay. And making mistakes. I was in a session once, and it has stuck with me for so long. And they said, if someone corrects you, that's because they like you and they respect you and they want you to do well. And if they don't, that's when you have the problem. But to be corrected in this work, don't feel badly about that, because the people who are correcting you care about you and the way that you're doing something. And so don't take that as a slight or a negative thing. It's actually very, very positive to be corrected in this space. And so just leave with that, right? That's okay. It's it's better than if you weren't corrected. So that's just to add.
Well, we've got a little bit more time here in case we want another perspective. I've got a couple more lined up, but is there anybody from the audience that has a question? Maybe you're all tired of hearing from me. Oh, there we go.
Hi, thank you for sharing your perspective, Isaiah, and just correct me if I'm not doing it the right way, but in terms of when you do the diversity work, and the closest thing that I have is the experience of being a Black man in terms of, like, I know it's not a one-to-one, but there's similarities or whatnot, but often when you see in the paid space of the work of doing that inclusion aspect or addressing it, and the panel touched upon it a bit in terms of, like, well, you're not an expert in everything and you can't be, but which way, like, it's kind of like that job, like, scenario where you need experience to get a job, you need a job to get experience, you need different people to be diverse, but you need, like, kind of like that safe space to kind of get them and keep them. And so it's like, is the work supposed to be done by the allies to kind of like go independently? Because you don't want to put that emotional burden on the folks that you're trying to represent and support? Or should it be to then kind of like the expert, well, not so expert, or giving somebody a safe environment to kind of like build you something? Like, so yeah.
I'm happy to answer that one. So we're all on our own healing journeys, and some of us as Indigenous people are happy to go into the space of educating, and some of us are not. But you'll be able to tell the difference of whether we're wanting to do that. So the other thing that used to confuse me a lot is we have a saying in the Indigenous community, nothing about us without us. But then there was that space of within DEI that says you shouldn't burden marginalized group with having to do the education space. You should be doing that educating. But I balance that out, that we're all on our own healing journeys. And I'm always in the space of educating folks because I want them to understand more about us. I want our voice to be amplified because it's been so invisible for so long. And I want to strengthen that. So for me, I'm very comfortable. But if you were to approach my mom, who's a first residential school survivor, she would not. She would absolutely close down the conversation and she wouldn't engage. So I think that opening that question with a good heart and good mind, Josh used that term, knowing that you have a good heart and a good mind to open that question up in a good way is a good start. But you will know, and they'll be part of your own learning as an ally when someone is saying, no, I'm not comfortable to go in that space of helping you learn about Indigenous people. But you will come across people like us who are excited that you're coming into that space, and we're ready.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think I think it's tricky because you want to be respectful, but you want to have the inclusion of voices. But it's also about knowing that sort of the responsibility towards reconciliation doesn't only lie with Indigenous people. So it's a different way of connecting in. It's sort of leading from an Indigenous perspective, but knowing that we all have some work to do in understanding, in talking about this work and being able to share about it. But there's certain times when, you want to have that Indigenous perspective specifically or particularly for something that you're doing. So
I'll answer the one other piece on that you mentioned that said, how do you get a job before you get experience? Mm-hmm. Because the panel that I watched this afternoon where all the young people were talking about how it's going to change working in the new places we work. I thought that was amazing. And I think a lot of those same threads are here, that the only way that we're going to change this and it's going to get better is by new companies being formed with new voices, with new directions, doing stuff not the way it's always been done, and moving forward and really disrupting on all in all sectors. And I think that's amazing. So that's why, and when I say like young people, it's like new entrepreneurs. So it's like people leaving corporate Canada and starting something else and saying, hey, I'm going to make this that authentically speaks to this. I'm going to make this that's a little bit different. So I think that's amazing. I mean, I think we're all kind of taught that we're doing stuff now to pay it forward so it's better in the future. And I see big things in the future for what people are going to build. I already see it in the types of new game studios, the new products that are coming out, new consumer. I've never, like when I was growing up, I never saw consumer products that didn't focus on sort of, products for the majority of Canadians versus products for, hey, you're from this type of group that you require this, so we're going to speak just directly to you, and we know it's a smaller group, but it's not all of mainstream. And then all of mainstream Canada kind of comes into it. I think if you're starting a business right now, that's where you should focus.
Yeah, and just in regards to your question around talking to people, and there are some shared experiences, and then we all have our own unique experiences, no matter what culture we're coming from. Even for, my siblings have a different life experience than me, no matter how much time we spent growing up together, etc. And so I think coming at it from like being bold, and what I mean by that is being okay to fail, or I remember in exploring my own identity, asking somebody, kind of a leader within the Indigenous education space, and I was like, okay, like what's the difference between, like, if somebody's First Nations dad is Cree and then and then they marry someone from Britain, does that make them Métis? And the response that I got was like not very friendly. It was like, oh my God, like, these people, you just, and I realized, like, oh, they get this all the time. And so, like, you have to kind of be okay with sometimes people aren't maybe in the place, they may not want to talk about it, or the way they talk about it is not the way you expected, and having that curiosity and discovery. But I think generally it's better to ask and explore and learn. And the other thing is, like, we've mentioned a couple of times around like the trauma and the healing, and there's a lot of stuff over the last couple of generations, and there's a lot of like cultural history and stuff that's been lost. But then beyond that, like I was saying earlier, there's so much rich history, and now there's new history being created every day. There's so much there to celebrate, and so many exciting things that I think we can, as people go through the healing journey, we're going to see, really amazing, like you're talking about companies or artists or different, all these different things that are coming out of this. Sometimes once you have any sort of think of a natural disaster, the green field that grows out later on can be lush and support all sorts of new things. And I think that's really where we're at in Canada, and even on the global stage. There's a lot of change happening in the world. And if we're just more open and willing to learn about each other, that's a great start. And I think the fact that you're asking the question means you're already on that path.
Thank you. And then,
we've already established I'm a horrible moderator, so I'm going to answer the question as well a little bit. I think there's a few things that popped out. One, as I've gone on my journey, I've started to really realize the similarity of stories between certain communities as well too. And so, like, for example, our buddy Dave is Samoan. He's also a professional rugby player. I said, is anything it used to be? I says, what on your body hurts? I said, and he goes, everything. And so, like, we had some amazing conversations, and you start to see the commonalities. I got a friend who's Hakka from Hong Kong. So the effects of colonialism, I think, permeate a lot of different cultures. Anywhere, it's saying third world, it's like, more exploited, which areas have been more exploited, and then you'll see the effects of that. And so, and I think when it comes to identifying, it is just having some thoughtfulness and understanding that there are some some triggers that could be there, and being aware when you're having that conversation to see when it's time to back off or time to change your path. The last was on like gaining experience. And I think as many of us here are from unconventional paths in getting there, you're gonna have to get real comfortable with failure. And so one of the things I encourage mentees is I say, what have you failed at today? And what did you learn? Because it's not pass or fail, it's more information. It's like learning about how you can navigate these pathways, because it's not like somebody's giving you a roadmap for them all the time. And so, by pushing up against things and figuring out what does and doesn't work, you'll eventually find a path from there. Thank you. It is an honor to be up here with you all. And TECHNATION, thank you so much for having us, and look forward to networking with you all.
Just one other point. We're around, or I'm around. Folks are around. So if you have questions following the session, just come find us. Tap us on the shoulder, ask the questions.
Thank you very much. A round of applause.